dreaming in a different language, as in, I started dreaming in French when I was 9, maybe, because I had spoken it since I was 5. So then, because what ends up happening is when I went to France the first time in 5th grade, so it must have been maybe I was 11 or so. But with living there and being immersed in it completely, I started involuntarily having dreams in French. And it's one of those things that I think only native English speakers don't understand, and psychologists didn't think was possible for a while until there was enough people who had done it. I mean, I'm not a unique person at this point in that respect, but what ends up happening is because I've experienced dreaming in a different language, I can understand the complexities of my internal neurological construct in a way that other people can't. And it also has to do, obviously, not obviously, I have a degree in psychology. So when you learn the basis for these neurological structures, but then are able to self-reflect and apply those concepts, then understanding what's happening when you're dreaming in a different language is a totally different thing, because then not only am I experiencing something that most people don't experience, it's something that I can then analyze to break down why it's happening, to then look at other people's experiences, to then say, not nobody can determine what dreams are until we have
Man, I've had dreams where the the local language itself wasn't even distinguishable as something that humans would speak. Like weird sounds that I can only describe as our synthesizers barely make these sounds when we use like heavy vocoding and talk boxing at the same time. Like you got to do some really crazy processing, and still it wouldn't even be the same because we don't. I don't think that we have the structures to make some sounds.
right.
We lack the physical
Yeah,
structure, the physics to
absolutely.
make certain sounds, and so like there are times that I feel like communication in dreams is this really unique place where, am I communicating with myself? Like, what version of myself? Did I leave myself a note? Is this just garbage I need to deal with and get rid of? Dreams are really, really
I mean, and
complicated.
it doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be all of the above,
Sure, sure.
which,
Am I like, essentially at that moment, am I the three blind men trying to describe the elephant?
basically. And then on top of that, that doesn't mean that going to sleep and experiencing rapid eye movement is the only way to access that plane, because then this is where the whole notion of the people who do DMT or salvia or ayahuasca,
Ayahuasca.
they
That's the
describe these
du
experiences,
jour.
but then you realize, especially with ayahuasca, apparently they're experiencing these things in their mind's eye, so it's not the same as mushrooms or mescaline, where you're actually physically seeing these things in the real world. So
Yeah.
that's kind of a difference in that. I think it's the same thing with salvia. I haven't tried DMT or anything like that, but it's it if you're not seeing something in the physical world, but you're seeing it in your mind's eye, that doesn't invalidate it as an experience, but it's also a different experience than seeing something with your physical eye. And in those two things, your brain really can't tell the difference, which is why people seeing things in their mind's eye still has a significant impact. And this is where, when you hear, hold on, when you hear things in your dreams, you're not actually hearing them,
Yeah.
but your brain can't tell the difference.
Sure.
Which is why when you
Well,
hear something that is constructed that can't be physically reproduced in the real world, that doesn't mean that you're not
isn't
actually hearing it,
I
because your
think
brain
I
can't
think
tell the
that's like
difference.
the most fun part about dreaming is that when you've achieved that dream state, that idealized, holy crap, everything feels real dream state, and you can't
Mm-hmm.
distinguish dream from reality. That's actually one of the most incredible experiences, I think, because you're presented with this alternate reality at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you even know if you're awake?
Right. And I think this is where lucid dreaming is something that people try to attain, but lucid dreamers like myself, it's terrifying, because then when you are dreaming, you don't know what's real and what's not. So then if you're awake through that transition period, it's okay. I'll describe it. It's as if you're in a reality, and then all of a sudden you step through Jello, and then your physical body is in the same position in a completely different reality. That's not fun. And this is why I think the media presentation of lucid dreaming is by people who romanticize it.
Exceptional Radio.
Exceptional Randos Show is produced live in Sunroom Studios Base Capsule and in partnership with KLST 103.5, RadioCallisti.org. Remember to catch our Exceptional Randos live stream on YouTube every Sunday between 2 and 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you have a story, idea, or question that you would like to share, we want to hear from you. Thanks for listening.
Wow, that was random. Exceptional Radio.
So it's February 2nd, 2020. It's Palindrome Day. And it's not going to be Palindrome Day for another 101 years or something dumb. And what else?
It was 906 years before.
Yeah.
Since the last time, apparently.
Yeah. So everyone needs to, appreciate this kind of numerology, I suppose, because I guess we can wait for it to happen on a Unix calendar. It'll happen sooner there than.
Yeah. Calendars are always a weird concept to me, because then this, relative to the notion of, okay, when we're discussing reality,
all time starts now.
Right. And this is when we're discussing reality, the notion of a revolving state of every year there's winter, and every year there's summer, and every year there's spring, as if these things can't change. As if the seasons are unchangeable. So then when we have climate change, people freak the fuck out because in January they're wearing t-shirts instead of the notion of this is just another day in existence. There is no actual, the universe has no January.
It's 55 degrees in
Or
sunny
February,
Bloomington,
sorry.
Indiana. It's February 2nd, 2020.
Yeah, whatever. It's not
degrees.
actually February in the
shit,
universe.
It's 55 degrees outside.
Yeah, so the universe does not give a fuck about this month that we want to decide to arbitrarily say, oh, when we pass through this certain section of the solar system with our axis relative to the sun, it's supposed to be winter. Well, that shit doesn't happen every fucking year. And in fact, the universe doesn't have a trajectory that's on a circle in the same way that the calendar tries to present it. And I think the main problem is the human brain needs this sort of repetitive pattern to make sense of things.
Doesn't our planet require 100 million years or something to go around the center of the galaxy? Something like that?
And even then, it's not going to go around the same path as next time around.
Exactly. But even then, it takes, some...
on a cycle that we can't even... Our species will be gone.
A time scale that's unfathomable.
It's not even experienceable by our species on the full time scale.
Yeah.
We'll either evolve or die off by the time that actual revolution happens. So we never actually experience a full revolution in the galaxy.
Anyways.
So this whole thing is an arbitrary presentation.
Plus we're spiraling around a weird circle.
Yeah.
As we go around the thing.
I think, the more I understand the universe, the more I feel as if the Gregorian calendar has intentionally been made into a prison for the mind conceptually to prevent it from establishing anything higher than what the church wanted to present to the people. Because then, even down to the apocryphal books, the things that were taken out of what we now know as the Bible are basically time travel and space travel.
Yeah.
That's the only way to describe it in
I'm
many
sure that's
cases.
like the basis for the New Testament, that Jesus went to the moon and
Well, it's Enoch.
oh yeah.
I mean, but Jesus could fly.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that they took out. He basically was the first. Well, not the first. He was one of the first superheroes because Moses was before him. Who else was there? Abraham. Technically, Gabriel.
Those guys lived like hundreds and hundreds of years too.
Right.
Like,
I mean, and the issue
when you
is,
read like Genesis forward, like it's like, oh crap, these guys were like 1,000 years old, some of them.
And then what happens is there is a point when the covenant is broken or something, and then supposedly Yahweh decides to limit men or humanity to 120 years in our lifespans, which, crazy enough, happens to be about the upper limit on human existence right now. I think the oldest person has been like 135 in recorded history, or something, maybe 131, 135.
I think about 15 years ago, there was a village in like northern Russia, Siberia, where the average age or average life expectancy was like 120 plus, because there was one group of people that had like all survived into their 100 teens.
Yeah.
They were all like 113 to 117.
But the problem is they didn't actually start keeping track of birth dates until the late 1800s, pretty much anywhere, because it wasn't important. And on top of that, so many kids would die that it was, I think in some cases, kids didn't even get names for a while. That it's like
they just call
the concept,
junior.
Yeah, the way we see existence of life now is so distant from what it used to be, because people used to die so frequently that, again, when we see kids as having an actual existence, that they were chattel 100 years ago, barely. Working in fucking coal mines in the early 1900s. I'm not talking about the 1800s. Kids were working in the coal mines in the fucking early 1900s. Yeah. So this is where we're so distant from that in reality, but in our heads, it feels as if that, that it feels like that was 500 years ago instead of 100 years ago, because we're so steeped in ethical society. But again, this whole construct is relative to a period of societal development that is really difficult for individuals' brains to grasp. So the notion of a period of Earth where humans could live for 900 years, we've passed the industrial era, and we live in a polluted world that cancer is rampant, and cancer is the norm for, if you live past 40, you're going to get a cancer of some kind in this planet. Basically, not because of the pollution, but for a bunch of different reasons associated with the industrial age. So the notion of these people who live till 800 and 900 is unfathomable to us.
After World War II, there was considerable atomic and nuclear testing, and this went on for decades, up until the point they started detonating in low orbit and in space. And they only did that a few times because they realized they were essentially creating a big dust cloud around the Earth of radioactive material and fallout. And this is a bad idea. So there are parts of the United States in the Southwest that are essentially concentrations for radioactive dust. The Southwest is not the place to be. There are other parts of the world, that used by Russia or the English or the French or the Chinese, and they're pretty isolated in their. It's not good because some of them were over ocean water, but for the most part, the big detonator is the United States.
Yeah.
Like, by far, like, there have been some gigantic bombs that Russia has tested, but
Well, it's crazy. There's a video.
they haven't detonated like the sheer volume of
Right.
fallout that's been generated as a result of testing is nowhere close to what the United States has
Well,
generated. It's terrifying.
And the problem with it is there's a video that shows the detonation concentration and when these things happen over time. Most of the detonations were over Nevada.
Yeah.
And that area you're specifically talking about, they irradiated their own country effectively on accident, and it was a bunch of miscalculations that led to this.
They had no idea at first.
They had no idea what they were doing, and they did so many of them that in the process where you see the atrocities committed with the nuclear weapons against the Japanese, it was going to happen to somebody. But in the process, they committed atrocities against their own people that we still don't even understand. Maybe all the stuff that's happening now with people believing in flat Earth and fake news as their go-to mantras is because of the fallout. You know what I mean? This is
fallout.
the DNA of the Americans could have been so corrupted that now we have these mutant right-wing people who breathe through their mouths and talk all this shit and have basically a monarch in power as if democracy hasn't been completely shat on by the process. And then they stick to their guns and they have all this, these marches on Capitol Hills and shit. So I'm not saying that these people are mutants, but I'm not saying they're not mutants. Because there's a possibility that their fucking DNA is just completely fucked, and these people are now the equivalent of Neanderthals walking around with MAGA hats on, and they just can wear clothes and look like us, but they're completely fucked. And that may be the radiation, man. That's that's all I'm saying.
It gets worse. So essentially, let's just call it the atomic age forward. So since the atomic age, basically all steel that has been processed has been exposed to some volume of radioactivity. It's all around us. Mm-hmm. It's everywhere. They blanketed the earth in radioactive dust, and we're all just dealing with it. Yeah. And so there's the military is really big on recovering pre-World War II vessels because that material was processed before the atomic age and apparently is like extra robust.
Yep.
And so they can reprocess it in a clean environment and render extra tough steel from,
Well, because you always hear older people talking about, back in my day, things were made better, and it's, then they go on all these different reasons, and it's like, no, boomer, it's because you guys fucking destroyed the planet that the steel is no longer able to stay strong, and it's brittle.
Yeah.
And they want to write off all these different things to not have responsibility.
My understanding of old vehicles is that none of them ever drove as far as cars do now. We have vehicles that hit 300,000 miles, no problem. Modern cars can go 300,000 miles if you change the oil regularly, keep your fluids topped off, take care of your car, basically. It's not that hard. If you buy a car, you better be prepared to take care of it. But we can make these things run 300,000 miles. I read about people who drive cars 400 and 500,000 miles. Mm-hmm. Like, there's a delivery girl or woman who drove her Civic like 1 million miles or something dumb. It's like, how's that even possible? But apparently she did it, and she only slept like 3 hours a day and drank lots of Red Bull or something like that.
But I want to see how many parts she replaced on that car.
She completely maintained the car, and when she broke the odometer, basically, she contacted Honda, and they checked it out. They verified everything, and they basically replaced everything underneath the skin.
Yeah,
they're like, holy
crap. But
I'm
saying in the process, how much did she spend on maintaining it? Because that's what I'm saying.
A lot of oil.
I'm sure. There's a whole lot of oil in that.
Holy shit. Oil, wheel bearings, brakes.
How much
pads,
did she spend
tires.
on doing that million to maintain the car? In that, it's not saying it's not worth it, but there's no way it wasn't equal or more than she spent on the car originally in the first place. Which is why. That's where there's this weird trade-off of
Because I don't think that a warranty. I mean, warranties only cover so long mileage.
Right. I
Within
think it's like
within
60,
a term.
60,000 maybe.
Maybe I don't know
I think
enough
it's
about
2
Honda
years on the first 60,000 miles or something like that.
for that. Huh. Yeah. Well, whatever the
I mean, in
industry
general,
standards are.
there's obviously going to be variation. Because then, you know, some companies have lifetime options. I think Tesla might have a lifetime option.
I know that there are a
Which-
lot of automatic transmissions made for internal combustion engine vehicles that have lifetime transmission fluid, meaning the fluid will last the life of the transmission. And so
Yeah, my car's supposed to be like that. You
Yeah.
can't change it on your own.
you can't even measure it.
No.
It's a sealed mechanism.
Yeah. Because I thought I needed to change it, and I bought some fluid, find out, yeah, it's one of those, and I'm like, oh shit, yeah. And
Then it's like,
those cars are
then it's
notorious
a
for
sensor
having,
or something, right?
Well, they have a notorious problem where they break down the transmission on there. So that's where I'm not gonna be surprised if it happens, but it's 20 years old and it hasn't happened yet, and it hasn't had the transmission fluid changed.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So
Yeah. No, I was reading about
still works.
There are like several companies obviously that are doing this where they have this sealed mechanism, don't mess with our transmission type policy, and I actually feel like that's the way to do it. This idea of a customer being able to introduce fluids into like one of the probably the most critical component in a vehicle is how it delivers power to the wheels.
yeah.
I know that some will argue that the engine is the most important part because it generates the power. But we can they can make engines of varying sizes, but transmissions all have to fit within a very tight like space.
Yeah.
And so
Well, and
big engines aren't the requirement, but there's always a requirement for a transmission no matter what.
yeah.
So it's like,
I mean, I think it depends on how they're going to service it, because if they offer lifetime transmission service on something,
obviously some
that'd be
vehicles-
awesome for that type of specialization. But then if they don't, then you're stuck going to somebody who's extremely expensive and only specializes in that thing, which then becomes an extremely costly endeavor.
I think that there are certain types of vehicles that should be user serviceable, like utility vehicles. So a truck should be serviceable by the end user, by the owner.
Right.
But certain types of cars, which are, modern cars are like sports cars were 20 years ago. They're all
Right.
fast. They have amazing handling and brakes. They've got all sorts of like extra
Pretty much all of
systems.
them.
Every car nowadays,
Pretty much all of them.
it has all the technology, and they're all pretty nice. They all get great gas mileage. They're all comfortable. They all sit low to the ground.
Yep.
They're all aerodynamic as can be, and so it's really there are a lot of things going on with that I think are dangerous for just a person who's like, oh, I'm gonna go and change some shit up. It's like there could be sensors involved.
But I don't think the average person does that, and I
Yeah.
think even then, you don't see a ton of modders buying those new cars. They buy the ones that are early 2000s.
That's true.
Or before, and they stick to those because even
where
the
they-
CPU stuff is not that advanced where you can still go in and mod your own cars to a certain degree. But that's like one of the reasons that car.
But do you even need to if you just go ahead and get like the car that already has enough engine?
Yeah,
and is
yeah,
already-
you do, because what the problem has become is the variations that you can buy out the gate make it feel specialized, but everyone actually has access to it. So someone who wants to modify their own car is going to be, they're going to want a whole different level
Yeah.
of modification, and that's
So I watched this video of this guy with a Honda Odyssey, the minivan, and they take his. I don't know what they did to the engine. They turbocharged it and did all this other performance tuning to it, and then installed a manual transmission in it, I think. And I remember watching it, and it's like, as I watched it drive like past the camera on the street, it really looked more like those back in the 90s, there were Honda Civics that were like basically a 2-door wagon that went all the way back and just got chopped off, like, and they had a flat back. It kind of reminded me of like a grown-up version of that, and it was actually kind of cool because it was this, shuttlecraft-sized vehicle, but it's like rocketing down the street. So I mean, I understand. I get it. I think there is a place for like really like out, like off the walls, like holy crap. Like that's like a serious tuning job where somebody makes a car do something incredible. But I feel like that's actually a really considerable investment versus
Totally.
like when we were in our 20s, people would just spend $100 here, $100 there with bolt-on parts and make their Civic or Mitsubishi or Toyota or whatever go a little bit faster every step of the way. And it always seemed like they were chasing some Mustang.
I mean, that's the way it was from the 60s
on
to the early 2000s, but then everything became too complex and too restrictive to do that, which is why, again, I think the cars that people do that on are early 2000s and before. But this gets back to, I think, why we're another example of how we're hitting peak capitalism, in that the idea of purchasing individuality has become so ubiquitous that the cars that you can buy from the dealer are customizable to the point that, again, the people who mod their cars then have to do some off-the-wall shit and have a complete unique setup in a way. You're gonna have to put $100,000 in at least.
Of dealer mods, I saw a Toyota minivan, whatever they are. I don't know what they're called, but it drove off the lot, like, and it had the coolest. It was like a matte black with red, with glossy red accents.
Yeah, you can get that shit off the lot now.
This is a factory option.
Yeah.
It's not even a modified vehicle.
Yep.
And it had a fancy, bumper and body cladding setup. It looked really cool. It looked like a shuttlecraft.
Yeah.
And I go online and find exactly what you just said. These are dealer options. These aren't even like, some of them aren't even extra money. Some of them are just like, do you want this? We can do that too.
Yep. Because it's so cheap now.
Yeah.
It's
a Toyota, and you're paying a Toyota tax for like a premium vehicle, and they can go that extra step for, like you said, nothing practically.
Well, and this is, again, everybody in the 90s who was buying all these expensive rims and expensive systems and expensive LED or LCD screens, they were paying for that technology to become cheap for the next generation.
Yep.
So now all that shit is super cheap, and that's why people don't care about doing it, because it doesn't show excessive wealth now. You can have 6 or 7 fucking DVD screens in your car. That doesn't mean you're Arnold Schwarzenegger rich anymore.
No, that just means that's what your car came with.
Yeah. So many kids, what is it, the minivan now? They come so loaded with entertainment screens, and some of them have games in there. They have touch screens.
Some of them have like multiple surround sound setups.
Right, like, in a way where
how does that even work?
Yeah,
they have multiple media zones.
They're doing it for families who have kids, so the kids are distracted. That's a selling point of it. But 20 years ago, you'd have to be a multimillionaire to even consider wasting money on a setup like that. So now the technology is so cheap that it's child's technology. It's child's play.
Yeah.
And I think this, the same shit happens with things like VR, where the sooner that technology becomes cheap and accessible, the more ubiquitous it becomes, but then the less it gets associated with being elite status. And that's kind of where we're at this point where the financial barrier is what defines novelty in many cases as trends go. So as soon as something is accessible to the regular people, it's no longer trendy on the visible level. It's just ubiquitous. And that's kind of where that shit happens quicker and quicker now. But I think at the same time, there is an element of people, especially young people. It's crazy how much young people are less materialistic over time because they see the fakeness that comes with the material things. So if anything, I look at the kids that are growing up, they are going to be what the flower child generation aspired to be, but could not become in the face of the reality of needing to assimilate into the workforce. So all the people who were fucking hippies in the 70s, they cut their hair and got cubicle jobs. And that's why the hippie movement died off, because they ultimately had to capitulate to materialism and capitalism because they had no choice. These kids are coming up with a choice for various reasons, and what's ended up happening is they're getting examples in the media as to why that lifestyle is vapid and it doesn't have a long you don't get fulfilled long term in that lifestyle, and kids are seeing it. And the crazy thing is the media is showing them this shit. So there's a TV show called Circle that's on Netflix that's about an enclosed experiment, and it's an apartment complex where they have 8 people as contestants, and the goal is to use social media within that context to become the top influencer and the most liked person among those 8 people, and the lowest person gets kicked out every day. And what ends up it's an enclosed system though, so only 8 people get to decide who gets kicked out, or only 2 people decide who gets kicked out at the end. But it's the influence.
This is a declining population of...
Right. Well, they keep the population at the same at the beginning. So then if somebody gets kicked out, then they bring another person in. So it changes the dynamic. So just because one person gets kicked out doesn't mean the person who comes in might not be more socially dominant in this context than the one they just kicked out. So there is actually a risk every time they bring in somebody new. And then on top of that, because they're all they don't get to meet each other in the real world, and they all have to do these exchanges through social media. So then you get this other dynamic of people who are pretending to be other people and catfishing, which adds this whole level of it's then the people who are participating understand that catfishing exists. So then they're trying to figure out who might be catfishing, and in some cases incorrectly guessing who's catfishing, and then judging somebody based on them thinking that person's catfishing when they're actually being themselves.
And this is a mini series, right?
I guess it's on Netflix. It's a game show that they released all at once for one season. So I'm assuming if this first season is successful, they'll do it again. But knowing that Netflix their model is only 2 seasons tend to bring on new users. So 3 seasons, they don't care about shows for that. I'm assuming this show will only have 2 seasons based on Netflix's capitalist approach to entertainment. But
Black Mirror started with 3 seasons, but they weren't really seasons. They were like the British series length of like 4 episodes or something like that, I think.
Well, were they also funded by BBC? Because in some cases you get these...
I don't know, but they had a completely different feel from Black Mirror 4 on.
Well, and this is what's interesting about...
They screwed the pooch with Knights of Sidonia too. It was like a space anime, relentless foe chasing humans through space in a siege ship. Crazy science.
Well, everything that Netflix has doesn't come from their production.
Yeah.
And this is where the things that come out of Canada and Britain and Germany have government backing so they can do more seasons. For example, like Continuum, or Trailer Park Boys is a good example.
I think the new Canadian show is Letterkenny Problems or something like that. about some guys who live out in the middle of like nowhere.
I don't know, man. I haven't heard of it, but they produce a ton of shit
I'm
because
sure
their government supports
yeah.
arts.
Yeah,
And
no,
it's really easy to get government grants to make
I love
media.
Canadian sci-fi. I think
It's awesome. It's my favorite.
They do more for science fiction than people realize, I think.
Well, and they're much more willing to examine the negative impacts of corporatocracy than American sci-fi,
Yeah.
or even British sci-fi for that matter.
Well, I mean, the corporations are paying for the production of the American
Right.
sci-fi.
Yeah, and that's the inherent problem.
Yeah.
Even then, you get, I don't know if a lot of people are familiar with this, like if you use military vehicles, the Pentagon will have to review your scripts before you release them. So that's what happens with Transformers and Superman.
It's no wonder that American sci-fi is always like got some weird military bent to it, or there's always something going on that's like there's always a pro-establishment thing going on some weird level. Like even when they want you to hate all of it, you can hate Wayland Corporation as much as you want, but without Wayland Corporation, that spaceship doesn't exist and the story doesn't happen, and we don't get any of that cool story universe without Wayland Corporation. So,
but if that company if Wayland Corp would have been synonymous, they wouldn't have been able to call it anything to do with CIA or FBI and still get any government support, because this is what happened with the was it Batman, Superman, or which
is the Return of the Dark Knight comic, and then
no the Batman, I think it was Batman, Superman, whichever one started with Lois Lane under fire in the Middle East. The government had reviewed it and had to cut out. There's a bunch of scenes that got cut for the theatrical release that the government didn't approve, because it made the United States government look bad, because they used the actual government instead of a fictional organization. So if you say the FBI is different than SHIELD, you can make SHIELD look bad because the SHIELD isn't a real government organization. So having the SHIELD stuff in Marvel is way different than if you have, even if it's a fictional FBI, if you call it the FBI or the CIA and you're trying to use military vehicles in there, the government's going to come in and say, we can't allow you to make our government look bad in any case if you want to use these vehicles. So it becomes a quid pro quo, which actually then influences the media that gets put out. Yeah. And this specific case is one of the reasons that film sucked so bad, because the intro sequence has the American military fucking up, necessitating Superman coming in, and because they cut it out, it makes no sense. And then people were like, what the fuck is wrong with this movie? But it was because the military had come in and requested all these changes. Even there's another scene later that got replaced because it has military involved in it as well.
It's interesting because I remember watching a version of that movie where the military definitely fucks things up in the beginning.
Yep. That's the director's cut that got released. Yep.
Well, that makes sense. Well, thank you, Internet, for delivering me the director's cut.
And I think they actually released it to Blu-ray eventually. But they definitely... Those scenes that were fucked...
It's a fire truck.
Oh, yeah. Those scenes that were fucked in the theatrical release fucked up the reception so bad, and the internet realized that's one of the reasons that people then came out so hard in support of the Snyder cut of Justice League, because everybody realized at that point that studio execs do have, I mean, not just studio execs, but there is influence on film releases that can alter the cut so much that it's something that even the directors didn't envision, because there's some other outside influence that's saying, oh, you have to cut this scene, you have to change this scene or that scene.
China tried to pull that shit with Quentin Tarantino for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
I mean, they did it with Iron Man.
Yeah, well,
Iron Man 3, I mean, because they changed the whole ending.
Quentin Tarantino is like, fuck them, if they don't want to watch my movie, they don't have to watch my movie.
Mm-hmm.
And so China's like, okay, we'll watch your movie.
I mean, maybe that's what they said over here, but they might not have shown it on as many screens.
Yeah.
Because then this is where they added a whole extra character and changed the entire ending for Iron Man 3 to get it released in China. And that's an example of, one of the biggest media companies in this country.
Wait, who did they add?
I don't think she was in part in the American version.
Huh.
Like, you wouldn't know because she wasn't even in the... well, you know what? I think she was in one scene. She was one of the doctors in the American version. She's like a Chinese doctor or something. And she has like one line.
Is she the Chinese doctor that built the Vision?
Maybe.
Okay.
Maybe.
Well, that...
I mean, I haven't seen it, but, again...
Man, now I want to go look for Chinese versions of MCU.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's there's some probably
I need to
not
get
a whole lot of vast differences,
I need
but
to get a hold of my cousin.
I
in
bet
Hong
Wong
Kong.
has more fucking scenes in Doctor Strange.
I bet he does.
I bet money he does.
He'd have to.
He-
He's like
he-
that dude's the man.
I mean, he is, but to get released in China, I bet they made that a fucking qualification that if you don't have more scenes for this release for Wong, we're not going to air it on as many screens. And that cut probably has, random shit that doesn't have add anything to the story. Because even down to, there was elements where...
It'd be the stuff like in the library where he's telling Strange not to do that, or taking books away from him, or just being a...
Right, yeah,
It'd
shit
just be
like
stuff
that.
like that.
Or him listening to Beyonce. They probably have a whole Beyonce montage with him. And that's where I bet it fucking works on, but they only made it a part of the shit here because they don't want to detract too much from Strange. Whereas, again, to get released in China, they probably made that shit a qualification.
Yeah.
I haven't looked at that, but I would bet money based on how they treat films. And representation in films for that matter, because again, there's this element of what people look, well, a certain demographic calls forced diversity is actually just equal representation that didn't exist before. Yeah. So the same thing when people are like gay agenda, it's really just gay people existing in places that they weren't allowed to exist before, like media. Gay people weren't allowed to exist in media before a certain time period. So now that they exist, the people that were okay with them being excluded call it a gay agenda, when really, in fact, it's them just trying to fucking exist, which is the craziest shit about it.
Yeah, when I watch movies from China, Chinese movies are really weird because they've got a really heavy, like, pro-state message behind them. Like, and it's really awkward because, I'm from the West. I have Western eyes. And so I look at this stuff and it's like, oh, they're just like, the champions from some state organization. But the reality is the state organization is comprised of the people.
Yeah.
Because China has a very different system of organization than we do. And there are a lot of things that look similar on the surface because that's just the way that humans do things. Mm-hmm. But there are a lot of differences in the way that they organize themselves. And so it's interesting because there's always this really intense, let's come together and solve this problem message. Yeah. In a lot of the movies that I've seen, like from Netflix, and they're starting to pop up on Hulu even. I think
I watch them pretty frequently now just to see.
It's actually really interesting because I think the message is we're here to come. We want to come together to solve problems. Mm-hmm. And that's not really the message that I see in movies from America. No. Which is very, very solidified in the individual and becoming the super individual. Yeah. And the individual will rise above and, save the day. And that's a fantasy.
Totally. At the same time, I think there is an element of preserving traditional Chinese culture because it goes back so far that can exist here, and then on top of that, because it can't exist here, the American culture has to has to define itself as the exact opposition in that it's meant to disrupt tradition, and they're going to go in and modernize people by destroying their tradition and making them stop wearing their traditional dress and their traditional tongue.
Yeah.
Because then what you see is, let's look at, for example, American speech. One of the things I try to do is be more deliberate about my speech, because our language has been I won't say polluted. It's been diluted with so many
It's been robbed
useless
of its
words.
context.
Well, it's not even that.
It's been robbed of, stripped of nuance.
It's not. Here's
No,
the thing.
I'm just-
I'm gonna describe to you exactly what happened. We have crutch words that didn't used to exist in speech that were normalized through media, beginning with clueless. Like,
Oh, the but like words.
those things did not exist before clueless.
Yeah.
Clueless made that shit ubiquitous in a way that is now defined with a type of existence that now has a stereotypical archetype, and there's a whole words or names to describe those type of people that didn't exist but are based on that period, to normalize that behavior in such a way that now crutch words are acceptable and normalized. So they're not, if you give a public speech and you say like or people are so used to it that they're not going to look at it as a negative thing. In the early 2000s, it was horrible. It was negative. It was a terrible thing to use that in a public speech. But if it was just layperson speech, colloquial talk between two individuals, that shit is every conversation. Every conversation is a bunch of crutch words. You go back and look at people being interviewed in the 1950s, those words did not exist in their fucking vocabulary. They didn't have any crutch words. And this is why if you listen to somebody like Malcolm X talk, he sounds so well-spoken and so constructed.
Yeah.
But it's just the time. People just didn't have crutch words the way they're so ubiquitous now.
I remember
they
going
not
to
exist.
raves and meeting people who would say, at the end of every sentence. It was like their exclamation point. And then I remember at one point, who was it? Who wanted everyone to back that ass up? It was Juvenile.
Yeah.
Yeah, Juvenile. Everything that he said ended with ha. Like, and so I feel like there was a really solidified period at the end of the 90s, like 97 through 2012, where the culture just kind of collapsed in on itself.
Yeah.
Because nobody wanted to think things for themselves. They just wanted to recycle things that other people had said.
Yep.
And this quest to, conquer slang, which is an indomitable, ever-evolving reflection of pop culture.
Disrupting tradition.
Like, you can't... That's like something an athlete would have to train for.
Yep.
So you're now
Linguistic Olympics.
a linguistic Olympian just to keep up with language. It's actually pretty reasonable to me that there's a portion of the population that lacks the faculties to speak clearly. Because it's hard. It's not easy. English is actually a very complex language.
Yeah.
It has more rules than we realize. It has more rules than they even teach you in high school.
Yep.
And then there's so many different ways to say the same thing. You can beat around the bush, you can just drive it home, or you can, tiptoe around things. And then there are levels to dialogue that can only be achieved with patience, and you have to dissect things. There's a very nuanced version of English. There's actually a really high-level version of English that's all like ologies and isms, and it sounds more like you're listening to science.
Well, that's what happens is
So-
these schools of thought develop their own lexicons and vocabularies, which is why you get this layperson saying of, oh, gravity's only a theory or evolution's only a theory.
But then there's a response to that, which is like, quit being so pedantic with your pedagogical
But they don't know what
tautologies.
those things mean.
I know. And then
which is then the problem of saying that to somebody who doesn't know what those words mean.
Yeah.
They don't want to go look them up. And then becomes the inherent problem of this notion of the feeling of having mastered a language such that you don't acknowledge low frequency words as being worthy of learning if you encounter them. And that's a byproduct of authoritative culture where people feel like I'm a native English speaker, so I don't need to use a dictionary once I hit a certain age. If I have a college degree or a high school degree, I don't need a dictionary anymore. And I'm going to pretend that I know that word that that person just said and act like it because that's what adults do.
I love looking up words. Looking up new words is like one of the most exciting things. It's like, oh crap, I've never seen that before. I think.
Well, you have to get over that.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to get over that feeling to be able to
My
enjoy
mom's
looking
also
up
an
new
English
words as an
professor,
adult.
and so I've always been surrounded by interesting words.
Yeah.
So it's, to me, it's like part of the journey.
At the same time, when someone uses a word that you don't know in context and you can't go look it up, it feels belittling, or what's the word? You feel ignorant. You have no choice but to feel ignorant because you don't know what they're saying.
Well,
and it's not a matter of ignorance being
for
bad.
a brief moment, you're isolated.
Yeah,
because
it is.
For
It's
that brief
exclusionary.
moment, you don't know what's going on.
They're using exclusionary language whether they know it or not.
Yeah.
And the problem is when academics and intellectuals intentionally use exclusionary language, that entrenches the anti-intellectuals into not learning the language either, and then creating their own narratives about it. So then that's how you get these flat earthers who can then, write whole rap songs against a fucking astrophysicist,
we know,
trying to discredit them with raps.
We know the Earth has a curvature because of geometry and trigonometry and calculus. We can calculate based upon...
If I don't know those things, it doesn't matter.
That's true, but...
You can't prove shit to me if I don't know trigonometry or calculus.
I understand. I get that.
And then my existence usurps that to me.
Yeah.
Which is fucked.
Can we put you on an airplane, though, that travels high enough?
Nope.
Nope. You won't go on an airplane?
Nope.
Wow. No wonder it's so complicated.
Nope.
Well, that one guy was willing to be fired out of a cannon.
And he...
only got like 200 feet in the air.
But,
broke
okay.
his rib cage.
But, okay. His thought experiment would not have given him enough trajectory to get to the point where he would then disprove flat Earth.
Yeah.
So his own experiment was a limiting factor that would reinforce his viewpoint.
Yeah.
Because he's not good at science. And this is the inherent problem with trying to let those people then set up the experiments to prove. Because then you have people who use levels on planes to prove the Earth is flat. And in their heads, that's proof because they don't understand what a level is actually representing.
Yeah.
But, and it seems like as if this person is trolling, but in many cases, those people who think that if you're flying flat at 40,000 feet and the level is indicating flat, that means the Earth is flat.
So, well, clearly they need to run that experiment while the plane is changing its trajectory.
But then as soon as you level off, it goes back. That's the problem with that, is their dumbass experiment creates this logical fallacy that it actually enables them to prove flat Earth because they have a terrible methodology.
Global membership in the Flat Earth Society is always on the rise. There's got to be a way around it.
Well, I mean, but even then, originally that shit was done as a joke.
It just got out of control.
But then that makes me wonder how much of that was done by the United States government, in that we have a socially engineered society that's made to appear that it's not
I
social
feel like
engineered.
that's the same thing that kind of happened with the Area 51 raid that turned
Right.
into 3 raves,
Yeah.
and a few people got arrested, and there was a video of one person, Naruto, running, apparently.
Yeah, I mean, they were on the part that we can see, which is where if we know about it, then it's not a secret, first off. And then on top of that, it's been known for so long that clearly if something is being hidden, that's not where they're going to fucking keep it. That's not where they're going to fucking keep it.
Yeah,
and
they're
then
gonna
on
keep
top
it in, like,
of that,
Area 52.
this is one of those areas where they've been doing radiation testing, like nuclear weapons testing,
Yeah.
for so long that maybe they're just trying to keep people from fucking getting irradiated.
Yeah.
And that may be the actual thing that is happening there. So there's so many more logical explanations that this to me feels like it's a disinformation campaign to keep people away from what's actually happening in some case. Whatever happening, their story about the extraterrestrial fucking camp is clearly not what's happening there. Because otherwise we wouldn't know that narrative.
Yeah.
If that's what was actually happening and we can't go fucking check it out, we wouldn't know that narrative. We would have another narrative.
I think the people that really want to know, really, really deep down inside have to know, the trajectory of their education puts them into a position in the military or in some kind of intelligence agency that requires access to that kind of facility. They might be a scientist, but I doubt that they're going into the sciences if they want the access to that kind of facility. Yeah. They're going into the military or an intelligence agency. And that's the thing. The people that really want to know will find a way to do it. And then everyone else who's just kind of passively interested and, has some kind of knee-jerk outrage about not being able to find out what their tax money is being spent on, they can get over it.
Right.
Because they don't actually want to know. They don't want to go through all the steps that the government requires you go through to have that information.
Yeah, that's very true.
I mean, I don't want to know those things bad enough to go through all that.
Yeah, because you could technically.
In theory, I could, but do I want to? No, I have way too many things that I want to do for myself that require that time. Mm-hmm. That time is valuable to me, and it's not like a quantitative monetary value kind of thing. It's like some things take longer than others, but some things are enriching beyond money after a point. Mm-hmm. And so, I've been watching Star Trek Discovery. I love Star Trek because they want a better future for humanity, for everyone, really. That's like
the Roddenberry vision.
Yeah, and so they don't call it the Prime Directive; they call it like Order 1 or something like that. But it's really interesting because, as stories go, it takes place 10 years before the story of Kirk and Spock.
Oh, well, maybe it hadn't yet become the Prime Directive then.
Yeah. Well, Starfleet isn't quite the Starfleet that we know at this point. It's actually a much they're facing all sorts of threats from Klingons. They don't even have peace with the Klingons at the beginning of Discovery.
So is this supposed to be connected to Enterprise? Is it like after?
The Enterprise will eventually appear.
I mean, but
Enterprise takes place before.
Yeah. But they're connecting them.
Yeah. It's part of the same universe.
Gotcha.
It takes place in the same universe 10 years before the original series.
Because I started watching Discovery, but I couldn't get into Enterprise because it felt like the first sequence felt like this is going to be a white man in his shotgun taking on space.
Ponderosa in space.
Right. That's what it felt like to me, and I was like, oh, I can't.
I've watched every Star Trek series and loved them except for Enterprise.
Oh, yeah. Okay, that's what.
Because when I see Scott Bakula, I keep waiting for Dean Stockwell to appear with his calculator and tell him that something's wrong. And I can't dissociate him from Quantum Leap.
Yeah.
He was good in that show, but I don't really see him as being the archetype for the captain of the Enterprise. Mm-hmm. I have a hard time believing that. And so, I tried to watch it. I've watched episodes. I've gone online to find out like the story arcs, the primary story arcs, the way to see the actual story of Enterprise. And what's interesting is that the first couple seasons, no one dies, and then it's like at the end of the show is where they start killing off characters. Whereas
Shit gets real then.
yeah, it starts getting more real because I think that's when they actually start having problems with Klingon. I didn't watch the whole thing. I only watched like select episodes. And I didn't really connect with it. I didn't feel like I was watching a Star Trek story. I felt like I was watching people in space.
That's what it felt like in the first 5 minutes to me.
Yeah.
Exactly why I didn't watch it. Because again, it felt like they were about to say, This
episode was brought to you by Space Cheerios.
Right.
It was just...
It's like the NRA
NRA
fucking paid for this shit, and they're like, put these guns in space. And then the guns always win. For the first couple seasons, we'll allow the guns to lose in season 3. But season 1 and 2, guns win. That's what it felt like in the first 5 minutes. Because I'm looking at it, this dude's shotgun fucking goes through Klingon armor. Versus in Discovery, the first encounter with the Klingon armor, you're like, holy shit, is this Halo? What is happening right now? What is this thing even that she's going up against? And you're like, oh, this is a Klingon armor that can fucking exist in the void of space.
Yeah.
But it's also vulnerable to the Batleths now because it's a Batleth, which is also made to go against other Klingon armor. So it's in building this crazy different...
We start to realize just how badass Klingon technology is in Discovery.
Also how violent space is.
Yeah.
And this is one of the things I think Discovery was good about communicating immediately. Space is not...
Well, you know, that first episode, they're inspecting an observation facility at a binary star system. And so it's already a really violent place.
Right. Space is hostile.
Space is super hostile. People don't realize, I don't think it's communicated thoroughly enough, just how dangerous outer space is once you start getting into debris fields. And, we have it pretty good. We have one star that we know of. And our star might have a binary pair that is like a primordial black hole that's the size of an orange. But for the time being, until they prove that, we live in a singular star system. And most star systems are binary or more. A lot of star systems have 3 stars, where there's the binary pair and that form a pair with another larger star or some kind of gravity well. But we have actually a very rare situation where we have one primary star, and our inner rocky planets weren't consumed by the gas giant. That's the trajectory for most star systems, and I think that I'm pretty optimistic. I think that there has to be life out there.
There's no way there's not, because we're here.
It's the chance of life only existing here is that's so laughable. Like I don't even want to waste the time laughing about it. But I think that the conditions that we experience here are actually not as common as people want to believe. I don't think the Goldilocks zone is where water forms.
No, not at all. I don't think so at all.
Water has to be brought here by comets.
Yeah, and I think there was probably a universal event that potentially created all the water in the universe, which is one of the, it might have happened at the Big Bang itself. Yeah. But even if it was the Big Chill, that
those preceded by the Big Steam.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. There's the potential that
in the beginning it was steamy.
I mean, the entire universe could have been the equivalent of a sheet of glass everywhere that then the Big Bang melted and then coagulated back into the beginning or the central point and then re-expanded.
Yeah.
So there's all these different potential scenarios for the creation of water in the entire universe that doesn't necessitate the Goldilocks zone. But on top of that, this is where I think media does a poor job of reinforcing the hostility. Because if you think about it, the Enterprise was rolling around space with their shields down until they encountered weapons, when in fact the shields should be up to avoid space debris of any kind, which you would think that if their deflector's not on, then they're not just automatically deflecting shit unless the base level existence is some sort of shield. Because then that's where I'm looking at it as if they should at least be rolling around with the shield on, and they seem to have it off when they're traveling, which seems to be completely counterintuitive.
There's got to be some kind of like always on magnetic field that prevents debris from embedding itself in the hull.
But then what's the difference between that and the deflector ray?
The deflector shields are for energy weapons and energy propelled devices.
So then why do they never discuss it? That seems to be, if there is something, there should be a mechanism for it. Yeah. But I think they just completely
gloss over it,
missed it.
Yeah, there might be something in one of those old Star Trek technical manuals.
I mean, I doubt it, because then one of the things that was raised is Picard should not be. You shouldn't hear the D if it's French. First off. Second off,
why does he have an English accent?
Exactly. So born in Le Bar, France, and I've heard different explanations, but French is not a dead language when he's born.
So I know somebody whose last name Boucher and Butcher. Mm-hmm. But it's actually a French name.
Boucher. Yeah. Which means to kiss.
Yes. And, but, they I think they're a teacher, and I remember they said something that, their students said, "Thank you, Miss Butcher." Mm-hmm. And that's how she said it. And so it's one of those,
anglicized.
Yeah.
I mean, but he was in France.
Hey, my name is TN.
And here's the problem.
It's not how it's pronounced.
This China. Trying to explain it in any other context other than bad writing is it doesn't line up with French represented in the rest of the show, because other people, the dude who played Odo, I think, is French Canadian. Yeah. So whenever he speaks French, he speaks it with a perfect French accent. And then on top of that, there's other people who speak French and use French phrases with French accents. Fucking
Jean-Luc
Patrick
Picard.
Stewart, Sir Patrick Stewart just could not do a French accent. And they recently acknowledged as much, because there was, I guess, they tried to do it with a French accent at first, and he just couldn't do it. So they went with the Oxford accent, and that's kind of where, again, there's a whole lot of things about the French. They could have just made him fucking British instead of leaving it French. But this is one of the biggest glaring problems with calling it fucking Picard. That's not how you say it in French. Picard. It would be Picard.
Is that how they say it in France?
That's how they would.
Is that
if it wasn't a pre-anglicized name.
I know, but are the people in France gonna call the show Picard? Or
no,
Picard?
They're gonna call it Picard. Whoa. Unless they add an E for the French version, then they would call it Picard.
Oh man!
Only if they add an E, which they might. I haven't looked, but if they're trying to.
I hope they add an E to the end of Trek.
Well, but it's a K.
Okay. So. Trek K.
Well, because I don't. They don't end a lot of words in French with K.
K is a weird
They use
letter.
QUE.
Change it to QUE then. Star Trek.
It might. Star Trek. It might be. Because here's another thing. The French government actively works to preserve the French language, which is also an inconsistency with why it wouldn't have been anglicized 300 years in the future. And this is an example is the Chinese government actively works to preserve their own language, which is why the writings of Lao Tzu are in the same script effectively 4,000 years later.
But you have to study that version of Chinese.
But it's still preserved.
And they're introducing a Romanized version of Chinese very slowly, but Chinese will be Romanized.
But when we're talking about somebody who is living on a plantation of their family's historical farm, he is the traditional quintessential French person where they actively, like Parisian culture, they've actively tried to preserve it for over at least 300 years, I think, at this point.
Yeah.
So this is kind of, again, that's just bad writing. We're talking about an area specifically that actively tries to preserve itself. They're not going to be using Oxford accents in fucking Le Bar, France 300 years from now. They're going to sound French as fuck because you go to French Canada and they sound French as fuck.
Well, isn't that funny? You know, I don't.
300 years later,
I don't
they
think,
sound French as fuck in French Canada.
I thought that they went to. At one point, he goes to like San Francisco, right, to go to the academy, and then at one point he goes to the Daystrom Institute, which isn't in France. That's also
Right.
like that's
So
like
I mean, yeah, but I like.
he goes. So like I didn't even think about him actually being in France when they were there. I don't even think about Picard being French, to be honest, because it's just
Because it's a poorly written element,
Yeah.
and he has the Oxford accent.
you know they could have said that he was Canadian, and it would have made just as much sense. They could have said he was American,
Right.
and
Well,
it would have
because
made just as much
because
sense.
then you get people in Canada who have straight up British accents
Yeah.
in the non-French Canada.
Yeah.
And that's why, again, this is a prime example as to why it's just poor writing.
It would have been
because they have preserved.
It would have been that much better if he'd have been Canadian. That
Right.
would have been like.
I mean,
I can only.
his
imagine.
family could have been settlers
Yeah.
in British Columbia. It would have made way more sense, and that even if they had the same farm
Yeah.
in British Columbia, it would have made way more sense than trying to put it in fucking Le Bar, France. Because then Le Bar, France is close to Switzerland, so it wouldn't have had it's like closer to Switzerland than Britain, and the closer you get to Germany or Switzerland, the more.
The more French it becomes.
Yeah, not the less. So there's all these things where, this is one of these elements where people, like, somebody pointed it out on Twitter, and you start to think about it, and you're like, oh my God, this is really bad writing. This is really bad. And we all just accepted it because it was one of these things where they didn't draw attention to it as an inconsistency, and you just accept it as being, oh, this dude from France speaks with this Oxford accent. But then when you really start to analyze why he shouldn't actually have an Oxford accent, because fucking Commander Riker doesn't have an Oxford accent. No other
So in
English speaker, native English speaker has an Oxford accent on that show.
I think it was interesting. There's an episode where Q gives Picard an opportunity to change his past, to avoid getting stabbed through the heart by the Nausicaan, to avoid having to go through heart surgery multiple times, to avoid ruining his friendship with two of his Starfleet cadet homies. And so he does all the wrong things, and he ends up screwing everything up again anyways, except he doesn't get jabbed through the heart, so he never becomes the captain. And there's this brief moment when Q is talking to the captain, and they show this young version of Picard. And I always had this really weird disconnect, because like no matter how much they said that's young Picard, it didn't look like young Picard. Even like down to the laugh. And they try to replicate the laugh, and it's just like there's something distinctly not right. And I'm pretty sure that they didn't find some dude from England to play young Picard. They just found some guy who might have been similar height.
Yeah. Well, and then on top of that, Sir Patrick Stewart looks like one of those people who has always looked old. So
That's right in Dune.
you go-
when he was Gurney Halleck.
Yeah.
He looked basically the same as
Yep.
young Picard and
Yep.
old. Well,
I mean, he was already balding.
yeah.
Because even I think there's like a video of one of his stage performances from the 70s of Hamlet or something. And he looks almost exactly the same. He's just a fitter version. But his face
And his
and
dome
his head,
is-
yeah, it's he's already balding at like 30 or some shit. Hardcore. His hair was gone. So when they're trying to put him in hair pieces or fucking make younger him look like he should have had hair. No, that motherfucker never had hair. Because, some people start balding at damn near puberty.
I'd like to see him.
And that's how they look.
I'd like to see him as Friar Tuck.
I mean, yeah.
I think he'd be good as Friar Tuck.
But he would have to be the version, well, depending on when, he would have had to be the version that was athletic and knew martial arts or some shit.
Yeah.
That I would have believed that version. I wouldn't.
He's like this
in a
is
fat
this,
suit.
This,
no.
no, this is a version of Friar Tuck that drinks the sacramental wine to unlock the drunken
Right?
master.
Yeah. I believe that version. If
A really spry, like athletic gymnast version.
Yeah, exactly. I totally believe that him playing that version. Potentially breaks out in song and dance when he's had too many.
He starts singing and dancing while he kicks people's asses.
Right, yeah.
Because he gets drunk enough to reach that level.
Yeah, that would make a very interesting character.
Like Picard as the bard.
Yeah, Picard the bard.
Oh, that'd be good.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, we've gotten to this point where martial arts films are so much about, now they're about reality and veracity to the movement in mixed martial arts to a very, they still have to demonstrate things on screen. So it's still somewhat entertaining and exaggerated. But before, I think there was an element of the more entertaining fight scenes were about something other than the actual I guess Jackie Chan's an example where his fight choreography was part of it, but the context in which he's mocking people and dancing around people becomes the artistic element, as to where now I think Donnie Yen may be one of the few people who still does artistic fight scenes that have there's like a meta narrative to what's happening beyond just the fact that people are fighting. It's like, oh, they're in a tea. They're
in a place and our hero doesn't want to make a mess.
Exactly, and they're trying not to. Every time they get close to a fucking table, he focuses on not spilling the tea instead of the fight, and that becomes the meta narrative where there's that's not existing in a lot of cases. So
now there's can't remember her name. She's in that Mandalorian story. She made a movie called
Gina Carano.
She made a movie called Haywire. Not too long ago. She's like a spook, and she's got there's a really interesting fight scene where she's chasing someone down, and they're in a hallway, and she pins him by planking up against the wall. And this is why I remember it, because she planked against the wall. The dude couldn't reach her, and then she did some other like weird, gyratey jujitsu thing, and kept on whooping his ass. I don't remember a thing about the rest of the movie because there really wasn't that much of a story. It was a cleanup job that didn't go right, and then people got mad and wanted to kill the people that tried to kill them. So it's a basic revenge story. It's not even a deep revenge story. It's an well, you'll see. I'll show you. It's one of those. But that one chase scene, because it wasn't like it was a good chase scene. I like good chase scenes. I still think the James Bond team does the best chase scenes where, they'll have these really good transitions between like foot chase and car chase, motorcycle chase. You get to see some really, talented parkour artists actually in the most recent generation of Bond movies. But there's something about a good chase, and it's hard to do. There's this like issue of pacing, and if the pacing isn't right, then you're screwed. You lose it. Ronin, actually that Ronin's a really good chase, has a really good car chase scene where Robert De Niro is in a giant Mercedes. I think it's like a diesel Mercedes, and they're chasing after some lightweight Italian sedan, and everyone's got guns, and at some point he pulls out a fucking rocket launcher, and it's all out of nowhere. The first time you see a good chase, it's just a thrill ride. I saw a movie the other day. It was a Ryan Reynolds movie. It was like it starts out with a chase scene with this bright, like yellow, green, like fluorescent neon green, like Alfa Romeo, I think. And they just trash the car, and people die left and right. I think at one point a fruit stand blew up, and so I didn't watch much of that movie. In Underground 6, I should have known better when the front of it had like a car explosion chase, image just for the movie. But that's a poor example.
Well, I was less offended by that film in that I was going in expecting, Michael Bay
Yeah.
and Ryan Reynolds, like, it's going to be peak what people think of them
Right
for
now, in the moment.
Right.
Yeah.
And in that, if it's a meta mockery of that, it's not as egregious as if it's only doing it.
But I felt like Ryan Reynolds was he wasn't even telephoning it in. He was like,
right.
He had somebody else tweet it for him type shit. That's the thing. That was what I found more offensive. And like Michael Bay does Michael Bay, and that going in, but
I mean, have you watched Bad Boys recently? 1 or 2?
Bad Boys 1.
It's almost unwatchable now.
Bad Boys 1 was terrible when it came out.
Yeah.
But
I mean, there's so much fucking misogyny and homophobia and all this shit that Bad Boys 2 had to apologize for.
But it was still terrible.
Yeah, because then you look at Bad Boys 2, that was basically two films stuck together.
Yeah.
Because by the time you get to when they go to a completely different country, that's a whole different movie.
Yeah.
And they just basically tagged them together.
They just kind of throw two personalities that we kind of pretend to recognize into a situation.
One's a heist film.
Yeah.
And they get the fucking crew back together, and it's basically Ocean's 12 or Ocean's 11.
But it's more like Ocean's 4 or 5.
Right. Exactly. And it's only an hour long.
The thing is, like, movies that have good chase scenes, you don't even remember the chase scene for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
You only really remember like a few things. The entire chase scene a good chase scene is so thrilling that you won't remember but a few details.
Well, that's just like now if you look at Bad Boys 2, the chase scene where they were destroying all the cars, it's like they're fucking 2000 Ford Tauruses, and when you actually pay attention, the cars are pieces of shit, and you're like, okay, no wonder they're tossing them like, fuck, those cars were fucking junkers in the first place that just weren't destroyed.
And realistically, none of those cars would have exploded.
Right, yeah.
None of them.
It's like a 93 Buick Regal.
Those things don't explode.
They're actually very well built.
Yeah. Those cars don't explode.
Yeah.
You have to get like Italian cars for them to explode.
Yeah, I mean, but this gets back to the whole reason cars don't explode that much anymore is because when the Gremlin did start to catch on fire, they had to create regulations that now you have shit where the fuel tank isn't in a spot and also not made of materials that are going to be easily combustible if it's just too hot out.
Yeah.
Or some shit like that.
Well, I think with those, it was like a seal that would leak onto the exhaust system.
Right. But
even then, our vehicles are considerably safer now than they ever were.
Mm-hmm.
Or they last longer. They're serviceable to a certain point. Short of getting like a truck, which really, that's like the kind of thing that I don't understand why people buy and trade up on trucks. That's a utility vehicle. It shouldn't need to be repurchased with any frequency. It's not like a car where the whole goal is to get like the latest safety equipment.
Right. Well, but then how many people actually use them for utility? And I think again, it's
it's a vanity vehicle.
It is, and this is why in many cases the people who drive pickup trucks are a specific demographic that's trying to display masculinity and not actually use it for off-roading or pulling or hauling or anything like that. The people that use the trucks for those things, they use dualies. They use fucking F-350s.
Or they start specializing their vehicle for off-road.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And
Start
those
specializing the vehicle for something.
and that takes so much time that they're not going to fucking switch it up every year or every 2 years.
Unless you're completely filthy loaded, in which case you just go buy the
But that
fanciest thing
person-
off the lot.
Yeah, that person
And-
doesn't really exist.
Yeah.
And again, that it's a construct of Bruce
Consumerism.
Wayne. Yeah, it's consumerism, and that it's presented as this fictional entity. It's like a fictional person that exists.
Keeping Up with the Joneses.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's always been a really interesting concept to me, that there is such a social drive to show wealth in that manner,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not. I remember when I was younger, I watched this comic, and I can't remember their name now, but they said something about if you watch people who have who don't have money, when they get their tax check, they go and they blow it on something.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you look at people who have money, like they don't wear it. They're not wearing it on their on their bodies. They're
Mhm.
like putting it into their investment portfolio, or they're putting it into something that they do now that it'll help them out better later in the long run. There's like a longitudinal planning that goes with money management that's not taught, and it's not
Mhm.
it's not implicit. It's not intuitive either. And
Well, if you can't manage 100, you can't manage 100,000. If you can't manage 100, you can't manage 1,000,000.
Yep.
Period.
Yep.
It doesn't. Money management doesn't magically come with having money, and this is a fundamental misrepresentation, a misunderstanding, but it's also misrepresentation in that time management, money management, people management, these things are presented as if they're natural skills when they all need to be taught or learned to properly execute. Because then even learning, I think we discussed at one point, people don't get good at learning until they've done it for a long time. And this is where, I thought I was good at learning, but I wasn't really good at learning until I'd finished my first bachelor's degree. I mean, I guess I only have one bachelor's, but when I started moving on to master's degree and understanding how to figure out how to gain knowledge and express it, it's way different than the understanding that's presented as if, oh, you go to school, you have a lesson, you take a test, you get a grade, and you learn. That's not how learning happens, and that's a formal learning setting, but most learning happens in informal settings anyway. But even in that context, the idea of how learning happens is something that obviously it changes over time, but my capacity to learn new subjects and relate them to the old subjects I know, and also examine them in depth rather than just on a shallow level, it forces you to acknowledge your knowledge gaps, but at the same time, when you're filling those knowledge gaps, then it allows you to highlight those gaps for other people in their own knowledge, so then you can help them say, oh, I don't know about this aspect of whatever. This is how you learn about it. And I think this is where teachers are meant to come in society, but because of the distrust of establishment and distrust of authoritative information, it becomes more and more difficult for people to find trustworthy teachers. So then they turn to people like Joe Rogan or Jordan Peterson, and effectively, in many cases, it just becomes the replacement for a father figure, unfortunately. And it doesn't have to do with the people having fathers. What I think has ended up happening is, in this same case, just because you have a kid, you go to work, you fucking buy them diapers, that doesn't mean you've been a good father to that kid. And there's all these things that people end up looking elsewhere for, in guidance or figuring out how the world works, even to the point when they're in their late 30s, early 40s, looking to people like Joe Rogan to figure out how to shape their worldviews, which, I don't think that's inherently a problem, but the issue is when people like Joe Rogan get trusted more, those people trust Joe Rogan more than they trust themselves, which is why they look to him for influence in the first place.
Oh,
That's the reality. And when you realize that's what's happening, it's why people like Greta Thunberg end up becoming faces of movements, because these people they put their trust and their power in others because they don't actually trust that they have the capacity to do anything or influence on their same level. Or
that's a culture of abdication.
yeah. Well, and you see it with people, the way people are mourning Kobe. It's what I've seen is ultimately when everybody has stepped back, some people even openly acknowledge that it forces them to acknowledge their own mortality, but it's also a wake-up call that even rich people can die unexpectedly, and it scares people because they don't want to accept that, because they're working towards this goal that has been reinforced, that you can become Dick Cheney, and if your heart stops working, you can just buy a new fucking heart. Capitalism will save you from death.
Yeah.
And that's the narrative that has been reinforced so much as to why people who are hardcore capitalists fight so much against other ideas existing. And it's this whole level of shit happening.
So I last week I kind of was away from the internet for a solid 12 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And when I finally got back into Facebook land, it was like,
R.I.P. Kobe.
Holy shit! It was the most intense virtue signaling experience that I'd witnessed.
It's real weird.
It was surreal because some people are all like, "Fuck Kobe,
yeah,
this motherfucker," and then some people are like, "Fuck the liberals." They're all saying he's a rapist, and then there are people who are saying like, "Guys, somebody and their daughter died," and then people are like, "Yeah, so did a bunch of other people. Why aren't anyone talking about that?" So like
everybody's virtue signaling.
Everyone's virtue signaling, and so some people are like, "You talking about me?" I was like, "No, I don't even know what you said."
Mm-hmm.
And then other people are like jumping in and fucking white splaining shit, and it's like, guys, just chill out. I literally just walked back into the room. I don't know why everyone's so heated.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to figure this shit out. What the fuck? Chill out. Everyone needs to chill the fuck out.
Yeah.
But it's so surreal. I saw this one screen capture, and this person said that if you want to live in a society where you believe that rehabilitation actually works, then we have to believe that somebody who has tried to apologize in numerous ways, both with his voice, mm-hmm. and then second with his actions after the fact, and with money and all these other things. If we want to believe that we live in a society that rehabilitates people, we have to be able to forgive and move on from some things at some point. Otherwise, people just want to harbor some ill will about something because it reminds them of something else. There are a lot of reasons, but what I saw was amounted to a bunch of people who were waiting for somebody to die so they could let it be known that they disliked somebody.
Yeah.
And I saw a bunch of other people getting mad about the way other people grieve.
Right. It's really weird.
And so, in my mind, it's all that everyone's grieving.
Right.
Some people just demonstrate it differently, and they signal different virtue differently. But it was all so surreal because everyone's spring traps were loaded, and everyone was ready to jump on everything, and everyone was just so mad. Everyone was mad.
Yeah. For one reason or another.
Because a basketball player died in a helicopter crash. I don't even know, is basketball even in season?
I don't know.
I haven't paid attention to basketball in so long. I remember the guy's name. I didn't even remember that he was in the news for anything. I didn't know that he was an accused rapist. I didn't know.
I mean, I knew, and my thing is,
to me, it didn't actually matter.
Well, he was accused and he was exonerated, but in the process, he acknowledged that they had an encounter which he believed was consensual. and she believed was not consensual.
And then all of her friends, like, stabbed her in the back. And
well,
like,
based on the way it was described, both of them could believe that and be right.
Yeah.
Because it was a different time. It was pre-Me Too.
Mm-hmm.
People who were victims of sexual assault were way less likely to come forward. So then what she presented, especially in the context of, I'm old enough to remember the trial because it happened, I think it was in Colorado.
Wow.
And this is where he was married at the time. So his wife is basically being confronted with him fucking some other chick, this 19-year-old white chick. That was a whole different aspect of it, because then black women were mad that he was fucking a white chick more than the fact that it was accused rape. That was a whole different angle on it. Beside that, at the time, they had the way that it was being presented, they definitely destroyed her character. I don't know if she was the person that they presented. There's all these things about what happened that call into question his character and whether he should be seen as guilty in the public eye or not. He was exonerated in a courtroom. So I have to look at it in the sense of, if I'm going to sit here and acknowledge that there is institutional racism against especially black males, if there was any chance for this system to put that dude in jail on especially heinous charges like this, he's going to end up like Mike Tyson, going to fucking jail. So that's, on one hand, I have to at least give the system some semblance of belief in the idea of justice being served in some cases, where it's like, are women lower than black men? Absolutely. And I can prove it in that black men got the right to vote before all women, not just black women, all women. So there's legal proof that this justice system holds black men of higher value than
I said
women.
It for years that I figured a black man would be president before
a white woman. Yeah, because they're more valuable to this nation. Yeah. Because we can play basketball, and we can play football, and we can hit people real good. We can do some mandingo ass shit. But the second
Bo Jackson, that guy, that dude was like
Mandingo Supreme.
Right? If he'd just stayed off the football field, he would have been like one of the greatest baseball players ever.
Mandingo Warrior.
Yeah.
And this is where as long as you the fucking Mandingo fighting for massa, you're cool. But the second you try to be an intellectual black man, they're fucking shooting your ass like Malcolm or Martin. It don't matter which side you're on. If you're the peaceful black man, if you're the militant black man, they're gonna fucking take your ass out, have a black person do it like they did Nipsey. I mean, and the part of it is, you don't have to give the order if you put somebody in a situation where they are, it's forced compliance in a limited set of choices that you can then activate by triggering something. Everybody in America is set to be gaslit for something, whether we like it or not, and it's a byproduct of everything that is our environment. Everybody can be gaslit for something, and it's just a matter of knowing what those triggers are, and if they have a fucking file on you, they're gonna know what those triggers are, and all you have to do is study a person for 6 to 12 months, and then you can just trigger that person. So you don't have to fucking coordinate a hit on Nipsey Hussle to trigger the person to go fucking do it. This dude just got out of jail. This dude was a product of the system. He's mad at Nipsey because Nipsey turned him away for something just off the blue. If they're monitoring this dude and they drive by with a song that's playing some shit, fuck Nipsey Hussle. That's all it takes to trigger a person and gaslight them to turn around and go fucking shoot them. But it's a matter of, people do not believe that those types of things can exist because they don't want to be the product of it. And we'll have examples all the time, like that Joe Schmo or Joe Blow or whatever show, where they had an entire game show that was fake, built around making fun of this dude as the mockery because he doesn't know everything happening around him is fake.
I think it was Joe Schmo.
And whatever the name of it.
I didn't watch it.
No, I watched some of it just for the sake of the social experiment. But this is something that we now look at in the context of game shows that is normalized as if the government can't do that to an individual to manipulate them. And this is where when people are put in these situations, they don't have to know that they're being manipulated into doing something for that shit to work. And this is exactly why, in this context of, knowing that the Pentagon influences media, everybody should be more aware of how social engineering works. But then they go in and mourn somebody who they have less connection with than the people that they choose to ignore and just give, sending thoughts and prayers when they know somebody that actually dies. Because there's still, it's not about shaming the mourning. It's more so trying to understand how these things happen when you see it happen. There's no other way. Like, we can't not discuss David Bowie, Prince, fucking Kobe. People put way more energy into mourning these people than they do their own friends and family. Why?
When what you just said, David Bowie, when all that stuff is going on, I thought to myself, where was all the David Bowie incense? Everyone just cried when he died.
Yeah,
it was fine. We knew that he was all about some underage girls when he was younger. It's rock and roll history. You gonna complain that Genghis Khan killed people? Seriously? You want to complain that Charlemagne killed people? I know it's unfortunate that shit happens, and we don't want people to die. We don't want people to be, raped. We don't want child molesters becoming social icons, pop culture icons. We don't want that shit. But I don't know. I think it's like what I saw.
But he was accused and he was exonerated in court. Yeah. And this is where, again, this is to me one of the dangers about the media, because then it's able to, because I don't know if it's because this dude is black, even though he was exonerated in a court of law, he's still an accused rapist the day he dies. Fucking 17 years later or whatever it was.
Yeah.
And that defines him even though he was exonerated. So that's where I'm like, I don't like basketball. I was not a Kobe fan. But defining him by an accusation is fucking weird. Because it'd be different if he was found guilty in a court of law. And it would be different if he had lied and tried to say that he didn't have what he thought was a consensual encounter, and then they found DNA evidence, I'd have a way different perspective. But he didn't lie about it.
I think that you've raised a really interesting question. I mean, what does it actually mean to be exonerated? Because
it means that they did not find enough proof.
I know, not from a legal standpoint, but from the sociological standpoint.
Right. Because
it seems to me that, Michael was exonerated, but it didn't matter.
Yeah. Which again, I have to say, if this system is as racist as I know it is, if they can't
exoneration is just a way that says that it's like, oh well, we don't have enough to go about doing anything, so we're dropping charges, but we'll let this sit in the public record.
I mean, and that's basically that's the court of public opinion.
Yeah, and because there's no closure for the public, people are left holding this bag of emotions that prevents them from really moving on about it, which is unfortunate. Because why are people investing that much of their psyche in someone else that
Yeah.
they've never met, they're never going to meet, that's never going to be a part of their life, that's never been, anything but some face on a screen. It's so absurd. Like the whole concept of fanaticism to me is so absurd, because it's like, I mean, I understand why people will be like, a fan of somebody's work, but to the point where it becomes about who they are, their that cult of personality.
Mm-hmm.
When it becomes something that's about this imagined interaction based upon a projection of personality, it becomes really scary.
Well, and I wonder how much of it is those people wanting to then have that same affection directed at their essence when they die.
Yeah.
And I've seen people post that actual sentiment, openly expressing it as if there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I guess there's nothing wrong with that perspective, but it's weird as fuck to outpour that kind of emotion because you want to get that same kind of outpouring publicly, because then it's all about show. It doesn't. It's the same shit as these people in North Korea that are fake crying over Kim Jong.
It's people intentionally performing good deeds because they want to get into heaven
and get the social credit.
Yeah.
But that's what it looks like in many cases, which is why it's so weird. And that's kind of where, again, it feels, a week later, I don't feel as if we're in the same virtue signaling boat by discussing it, because it was a whole phenomenon. And in that, we have to look at this phenomenon, because it wasn't the first time it's happened. I think it was one of the first times it's happened on this scale that has tried to persist. Because then you have all these people giving him like honorary seats at the stadium or some shit, and moments. Because then that's what I'm saying. It's like, because I started monitoring people's not monitoring. They were so ubiquitous that if I'm watching a podcast about MMA, I'm starting to count how many minutes are they going to devote to remembering Kobe. And the average was about 6 minutes.
Wow.
And as the week went on, it started to cut to like 3 minutes.
Fight.
Right, yeah. But it was so ubiquitous where you go check. It's either at the beginning or at the very end, and it's about 6 or 7 minutes of Kobe devotion. And then you look, it's for fucking clicks, man. Mm-hmm. They're all doing this R.I.P. Kobe for fucking likes and clicks. Yep. And that's why it's so gross. That's why I'm like, how do they not know that it's transparent what they're doing, but they do it anyway, as if the sentiment is real. But then it's hard to know. Like, I know my cousin has been a Kobe fan since Kobe was
in college,
in high school.
Ooh.
In high school, because I don't think he went to college.
Okay.
I think he skipped college, if I'm not mistaken.
Sure, I don't know.
Well, because my cousin was a huge fan of him.
Okay.
I messaged him, be like, "Are you okay?" Because I know this dude has an actual emotional attachment that goes back for fucking 2 decades.
He probably has a Kobe shrine.
Probably.
Yeah.
But I'm saying, I know this dude has an emotional attachment to this person that is not anything to do with social clout.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with social clout.
He just loves watching.
He just loved watching Kobe play basketball.
Yeah.
He loved watching that dude play basketball. Because he loved basketball before Kobe.
Yeah.
So when Kobe came along,
he just got to see someone who did it exactly the way he thought it should be done. Right?
Exactly. And that's what Kobe represented to him. So when I'm looking at him, I'm like, oh, I'm not saying, oh, his is only the justified. I'm not saying that. Yeah. But I get that. I get when he's like R.I.P. Kobe, because Kobe actually affected him dramatically.
I think
a whole lot.
Michael Jordan said that Kobe Bryant was one of the greatest.
Mm-hmm.
I think that says enough.
Right.
Like, he's one of the greatest basketball players.
Yeah, but if you don't care about basketball...
I don't care about basketball, but Michael Jordan's opinion about basketball players is still pretty serious.
But did you say, you know what I'm saying? Did you make a fucking speech about Kobe?
No, I guess this is the speech about Kobe. I mean...
But it's not. We're talking about...
No, I know.
You know?
Yeah, no, but that's the thing. Is like, so when I was in when we were in high school, the Bulls were unstoppable, right? They did the three-peat. They won every time. They were the best basketball team to ever exist. They won in ways that were like impossible, and they had the best scorers that had ever played the game, and it was a really hard athletic game. They charged the basket more, it seemed. They went for it. And now the game that I don't really watch anymore, it's all like this really strategic positioning and like long shots and a lot of passing, and it's still basketball. It's still really interesting. And these players are incredible. Like they can hit shots that are just like, what the really? And that stuff's great. But the version of basketball that I remember watching when I was younger was so different. It's really surreal.
And here's the thing.
No, here's what I'm getting is that like I don't really pay attention to basketball. I only ever watched like the big games.
Yeah.
And so to see it change year by year, same thing with football. I only ever watched Super Bowl, but to see it change subtly year by year because I'm not watching regularly.
Yeah.
It's really incredible to see the evolution of the strategy and the tactics they use, and then the way they leverage certain players' like size and ability. Like you can tell that there's a huge chess or even a go mind behind some of the way that they're working strategies. And I don't think that the people who played back in the 90s would be as competitive as they were then now. And I don't think the people who are competitive now would be as competitive back in the 90s.
But it's for another reason in that
there are a lot of rules that have changed.
That's exactly it. And it
so
happens
many
in every
rules.
sport
Yeah.
because as sports progress, they change the rules to try to preserve the athletes. And that means now there's probably less blown ACLs, less broken ankles, less twisted ankles,
fewer traumatic
fewer
head injuries,
broken noses from fewer fouls.
Yeah.
Changing the 3 in the key rule means that people are going to be charging less. More charging rules means it's going to have fewer people falling over and fracturing things. So there's all these things that the game in the 90s and the 80s was way more physical. So if you were going against somebody like Larry Bird or Magic Johnson, they're going to fucking elbow you in the chin and hope that the ref doesn't see it. But that shit can't happen now because we have instant replay.
Yeah.
And they didn't have as much access to the technology then. And then on top of that, instant replays weren't even legal in some contexts until the rules changed. Yeah. So if you got away with the elbow and the ref didn't see it.
It's crazy the games that... And even further, if you go back and look at like the generation that Wilt Chamberlain played, those guys had elbows that were like
they were straight up punch people and shit.
Yeah. Like I don't even think that the 90s basketball players would have been competitive in that era because they weren't big enough.
Nope.
The guys in Wilt Chamberlain's era were huge. They were all huge. Like
in a different way.
Yeah.
In a different way, because that's why
let's also remember that Wilt Chamberlain
starting in a Conan movie, in that you can't imagine a fucking NBA player starring in a fucking Conan movie today.
His martial arts instructor is Bruce Lee. Let's remember, like...
That was Kareem, though, right?
Kareem? Was it? Oh, yeah, it was Kareem. Sorry.
Yeah. Because he was in Game of Death, and Wilt was in Conan.
He was in Conan.
Yeah.
He's a big fucking dude.
Yeah,
These
but
are
I'm
all
saying
big dudes.
he was big in a different way, whereas LeBron's a big dude, but I'm not... He's not in a Conan movie. No, he's in a Space Jam now.
I can see...
You know what I'm saying? Michael Jordan was in Space Jam, not Conan.
I can see LeBron being in like a movie with The Rock.
But The Rock is the one that's the big dude, even though The Rock is shorter.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that's where he's not... He's not going in a movie with somebody like Arnold Schwarzenegger. Even at Arnold's age, LeBron is going to look smaller than Arnold, even though he's taller. Yeah. And that's why, again, Wilt Chamberlain is just a different kind of big than even the 90s NBA players. And that's, again, things change in such a way that...
that's you're right. There's... It's not really... I'm not really even trying to compare the two. It's hard to not compare them, though. And I know that the game has changed, but it's like... It's so surreal, because in my mind... The version that I watched in the 90s, that's like basketball. And this the version that they're playing now is this, it's got it's been made child safe in a lot of ways.
Yep.
They've made it so that it's less. They can't even engage in that kind of play anymore.
I actually saw there was a chart that they showed since the rule changes where all of the shots happen, and they've all migrated to the 3-point area and about 20 feet out where the free throw area is, but in the kind of an arc.
Yeah.
So exactly what you're saying, they have statistic proof to show that the game has migrated to those areas. Yeah, that's where all the scoring happens.
Yeah, because they can't really get into the key anymore, right?
Nope.
That's the hard part.
Yep.
Because the defenses have changed so dramatically over the past
and the
decades,
rules
and the rules have changed, and so that the game is different.
Yeah.
That would that would be the best. This is the best argument for a time machine that I can think of, is to go and grab like the best players through the ages and give them like an era-specific team to face off different eras. That's a really good use for a time machine.
I mean, because you even see the same with boxing or martial arts where, Cuban boxing style, try to do that shit today. No fucking way. But, the early 1900s, that shit was dominating. Cuban boxing, it looks just straight up awkward now. But
I think that's the point. I'd like to see Babe Ruth's Yankees versus whatever some fantastic baseball dynasty is.
But they'd have to be able to do cocaine.
Let them do cocaine. I don't care. Let them drink and do cocaine on the field.
Yeah. No, I mean, but that's what I'm saying is in that now we have so many rules that are preventing those people from taking horse fucking testosterone or some shit that they could have been doing then.
That's the thing. Like I'd like to see Greg LeMond versus what's his name? The cyclist with the missing balls.
Armstrong.
Yeah, that guy. Yeah, I'd like to see them in a cycling race. I'd like to see some classic cyclists from way back in the day when they were drinking alcohol all the time versus Lance Armstrong.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to see Mike Tyson versus heavyweights through the ages.
Yeah.
I'd like to see young Mike versus old Mike. I'd like to see, but allow old Mike to know everything that he knows, and.
Well, but that's just like him being in Ip Man 3 was fucking pretty amazing, where he's going against Bruce Lee's master as if he's himself, but as somebody else, obviously. But that's a great exploration of that concept that they did on screen, which is why, again, when they have these, Donnie Yen is very much one of the more modern martial artists that does meta narratives in their choreography. But in that, I think that was beautiful that he incorporated Mike Tyson's style specifically as if this is what it would look like against
an American boxer.
Yeah, and in that displaying,
even though Mike Tyson's boxing
exactly.
style wouldn't exist for another
Right, exactly.
What if Ip Man is such a badass that he can keep up with a style of American boxing that wouldn't exist for another 70 years?
Mm-hmm. And that's what they're expressing.
Which became one of the most dominant boxing styles for a decade or so.
Yeah. Because even Jack, if they would have made the character try to fight like Jack Johnson, it wouldn't have looked the same.
Mm-mm.
But they made him fight like Mike Tyson. And so, again...
That's a really good scene, too, because Mike Tyson, when he approaches him, it's like a train.
Mm-hmm.
And he's old Mike, and he's still,
he's still quick. Explosive, which is, I think that gets back to the element of there are only certain things that somebody with his genetic makeup and expression of those genetics can do. Everybody can't be as explosive as Mike Tyson. Yeah. Everybody doesn't have the genetic capacity.
Mike Tyson went to prison. He was reformed. He is rehabilitated. Mm-hmm. There's still people that want to be mad at him.
Yeah.
But for the most part, it seems like everyone's allowed him to move on.
Pretty much, yeah. I think part of it is because he he was one of the first people to do a public apology circuit and acknowledgement of his wrongs, because I think he went on Oprah.
Yeah.
And she, pummeled him with questions.
She did her
about,
Oprah thing.
Yeah.
If you can survive this line of questioning, you might be a person questioning.
Right. Yeah. Whereas before he had gone to jail, he was talking to the reporters and just talking to them like pieces of meat. And he definitely came out of jail a much different and more. Well, it wasn't immediate, because I think when he first came out, he was still talking a bunch of shit. But it was once he, did that apology circuit that I think people really started not looking at him as the angry black man that he was he was trying to portray that for a long time. But I think he realized it was working against him and wasn't going to help him live a long life if he kept, in the same way that Tupac, his life was cut short because he tried to live what he portrayed, even though he was an art student that was an actor. I mean, Tupac's mom was a
Black Panther.
Black Panther, but Tupac went to fucking art school.
Yeah.
Juilliard. And that's where, again, it's like, he was many things, but he was most certainly not what he portrayed himself to be on Death Row Records. That was only an exaggerated and very fictional element of his personal character. Because again, it's like, yeah, he shot an undercover cop who was fucking with somebody else. So there's all these things about him. And he also went to jail for rape, where it seems like he got, publicly exonerated from it or whatever. Maybe because he died. I don't know. But that part of his history, people seem to, want to write off too.
People... I must not have been exposed to enough of certain musicians' music, because I remember a lot of people dying in the 90s and early 2000s, and there was a lot of overwhelming sadness about it. And I could never fully understand why. It's like, I liked TLC, but I wasn't like, my life didn't end when Lisa Left Eye Lopez.
You don't know her.
I know. And the same thing happened with like Aaliyah. It's like, oh, it sucks that her plane crashed, but like, I'm not like, I don't understand the complex emotions that are being projected out from people. Like, somebody explained, but nobody had time to explain because they were too busy crying. It was a really complex situation, and I couldn't wrap my head around it.
Yeah.
And then there are a lot of musicians that when they die, it's like, thank you for your contributions to music.
Right.
But I'm not like, setting up some giant effigy.
Yeah.
And
in some cases, it feels
that's that
fake.
fanaticism. It doesn't seem. It feels like there's. I'm not sure what it is.
It feels like they're mocking emotional expression, but they don't realize it's a mockery because they are doing it because that's what they believe people want to see from them.
Yeah.
Which is, again, it becomes this, we have to analyze it to truly understand what's happening, because it's hard to understand, like, what the fuck is happening? All these people, like, I know all these people don't actually watch basketball, and I know you weren't watching the fucking Lakers, so why are you saying R.I.P. Kobe and saying how much he influenced you with his love for a thing when you didn't actually follow it, and are saying you didn't actually follow it, but are moved by the sentiment? Is this weird, like...
Yeah, that's exactly why I couldn't understand what was going on when that happened. Also, I walked into it. It wasn't like breaking news and everyone finds out at the same time. Because I've been on that wave of information release where it's like, holy crap, guys, this shit just happened. Shit's getting real. That's different. But
I don't know if you realize, one of the big parts about it that was so fucked is that TMZ ran the story before his own family found out from the cops. The cops tried to stop them from running the story because they're like, hey, we want to fucking notify his family before you guys go running this fucking news story to sell ads. TMZ wouldn't do it. They ran the story, so his family found out from fucking TMZ because TMZ wouldn't not run the story at the cops' request.
So, okay, that actually explains a lot more.
And I don't think a lot of people realize that shit happened.
Yeah. No, I didn't even know that happened. So I understand then why some people would be really mad, because if the first thing they do is see like this notification about Kobe Bryant, and then it starts to come out that like the family has just finally been notified later, I can see why there would be some kind of displaced anger towards TMZ for basically like engaging in some kind of unethical behavior or ethically questionable behavior. They shouldn't have done that, obviously, but they're capitalists.
Yep.
This is a free economy, and if you want to value capitalism and free economy, we have to accept that this shit happens.
And this is the problem: is people are getting effigies with advertisements in between and not questioning it, and this is the ultimate problem.
You're right.
Like, why is there a fucking ad between these effigies?
Why is anybody making money off of somebody's death? Why is somebody profiting from that? I understand why somebody who makes caskets profits, because they're physically producing caskets. And I understand why a funeral home makes money, because they provide a space for that kind of for a service. And I understand why there's an industry that's there to directly support people dying and passing on and moving on to the next chapter. But online magazines shouldn't be profiting from that. I don't think. I feel like that's one of those like morally bankrupt activities that we typically reserve for criminals to profit off of someone else's death.
Yeah, I think that's where again we have to start telling people, like, if you're getting something that is supposed to be emotionally significant, and then there's an ad immediately after, who bought that ad and who's trying to emotionally manipulate you? Because those two things should not be packaged together. And that's where, again, I think people should just step back and be very aware of what's happening around them right now. Because, again, it's hard to know, is this organic? Is everybody really this sad? Because that's kind of weird. I didn't, it'd be crazy if this really is true emotion, then I really have no understanding of humans.
Yeah. No.
If this is real, I have no understanding.
There's so much of it that it doesn't make sense, because I just keep coming back to this idea that why if this person is so mad at somebody, why are they waiting till they're dead? That to me is just like, why is it only coming up now?
Yeah.
And I understand that there's a lot of resentment and anger, and I read one explanation is that some people have been traumatized by something, and it's related to it somehow. There's some kind of trauma that's being revisited, and then for some people it's because they're proactively against anyone who is a sexual predator. And there's this, they insist that, it's like those people don't change. But that denies the potential for a system that rehabilitates people.
But he was never
He was
found guilty.
I know, that's the problem.
And that's the whole fucked up part about this narrative. Again,
I know, that's
what it's the full circle of like, why are we discussing the rehabilitation of somebody who was never actually found guilty of what they were accused of, as if those two things are the same? That's like a weird place to be. And I think it acknowledges that accusations are ultimately the same as an action in a society that does not permit accusations to be found as actual accusations and not reality.
Well, we've come to this place socially where we are finally listening to victims when they come forward, And
Yeah.
so, this is tough because this is like looking into the past with a modern lens.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's no real way to be completely objective about it because we can't take off this lens. We've got a modern perspective. We've found ourselves in a place socially where we can look at these issues and address them and look at the outcomes too. We can track the outcomes finally.
And in that, we shouldn't take off the modern lens because then the older people will look at that argument and say, well, you can't judge the previous times by your modern. No, the fuck we
No,
can.
we have to.
We have to. And
Yeah.
that's why, again,
But do we retroactively go back and reapply some judgment to some case that was resolved within the court system? Like, I mean, how far? I suppose if there's if federal marijuana legislation like allows people to smoke it recreationally, are they going to go back and wipe people's
they
federal
do in some
records?
cases. So they did in Seattle or in Washington State. I think they did in California.
But does that wipe off the federal record or just
Well,
the state records?
Well, it was the state, but they don't have the power. Like, if the federal government decided to do that, but if it was a state conviction, it wasn't a federal conviction in the first place.
Yeah.
But again, this is where, this is why people get exonerated fucking 100 years after their death on record. Like Jack Johnson.
Yeah.
Jack Johnson was only exonerated fucking recently by Trump.
Yeah.
That's 100 years later. So apparently it means something in the public opinion, even if it's 100 years later after you died.
But do you have to be dead for it to work?
Not necessarily, because look at OJ.
Yeah, I get. Well, his dumbass went and held some people hostage in a
Right.
Vegas hotel,
Which became a whole different thing.
Oh man, yeah.
And then it colors how people revisit their analysis of the first thing.
Yeah.
So again, public opinion obviously is not static, but people think that their
Can
opinion.
public opinion even be trusted, really?
Fuck no. Wisdom of
crap.
crowds is not actual wisdom.
Yeah. Oh no, that's true. I remember reading a study recently where they determined that when you get a group of really intelligent people together, there's actually a brain drain.
Yep.
But when you put a group of less than really intelligent people together, they experience a brain gain.
Yep. But it all averages out in
But
that
it all averages out anyways.
The mere existence of a crowd influences how that crowd then takes in information, because then they start to see how other people are analyzing things, and that determines how then they all vote, which is again why Circle is such a good examination of human nature. And I think that's, if anybody has not checked out Circle, it's good to check it out just for the sake of it forces you to analyze your own interactions with social media, because it shows how, especially in the case of the people pretending to be others, everyone is faking some part of what they're doing when they're engaging with social media.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter who you are. You have to be fake only in that the medium limits your expression, so you can't show your face.
I try to be really honest with the Facebook page, the artist page that I created to
But you still always censor yourself
to market the show,
whether you like it or not.
But I have to censor myself on that platform, because
on every platform, because otherwise you also don't want your entire inner monologue to be accessible, because then you are publicly mapped out in a way that most people who understand what that means don't actually want, and then they censor themselves to not do that.
That's part of I think that's part of the dilemma with especially with the nature of this medium, is that we're creating a public record of our thoughts and our ideas, and hopefully it's reflected over time that our ideas will change, and our thoughts are not fixed or written in stone, and but it's very easy for ideas to be taken out of context, and I think that's what social media really does best.
Yep.
It takes away all the context. It allows people to create that best version of
Well,
themselves.
spin culture happened in the 90s.
Yeah.
And then now social media makes it so that it's spin in tandem with virality.
Yeah.
It's a weird time. You know, ideas are viruses, and it's, you know, people have to inoculate themselves against bad ideas.
Yeah.
Is what it comes down to.
Exceptional Radio.
Exceptional Randos Show is produced live in Sunroom Studios' Base Capsule and in partnership with KLST 103.5, RadioCallisti.org. Remember to catch our Exceptional Randos live stream on YouTube every Sunday between 2 and 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you have a story, idea, or question that you would like to share, we want to hear from you. Thanks for listening.
Well, that was random. Exceptional Radio.